Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking those dense PMI-RMP course notes and official practice guides and turning them into a clear, no-nonsense roadmap for mastering Domain 3 risk analysis. So if you're gearing up for your certification, or honestly just looking to level up how you handle project uncertainty, you are exactly where you need to be. Let's get right into it.
All right, let's set the stage by acknowledging the incredibly high stakes we're dealing with. Domain 3, it accounts for a massive 23% of your entire certification exam. Think about that. It's nearly a quarter of your final score. This domain right here is the critical bridge. It's where we take raw, newly identified risks and actually transform them into solid, decision-ready priorities.
To conquer that 23%, here is our game plan for this explainer. We'll decode Domain 3. Dive into Task 1 on qualitative analysis. Look at how to defeat human bias. Tackle Task 2 on quantitative analysis. Explore Task 3's threats and opportunities, and then tie it all together with your final exam takeaways. Let's move. So kicking things off, decoding Domain 3, which we like to call the risk funnel. You can literally visualize this entire domain as a giant funnel. In project risk management, we start incredibly broad, and then we purposefully narrow our focus as we dig deeper into the analysis. Right at step 1, we throw in every single raw identified risk. Then, at step 2, we sort and prioritize them qualitatively. Moving to step 3, we get picky. We apply selective numerical logic and quantitative modeling, but only to the most complex risks. And finally, step 4. Those carefully analyzed risks pop out completely response-ready. And here's the kicker. You absolutely cannot jump from step 1 to step 4 without passing through this funnel. It just doesn't work. Moving right along to Task 1, qualitative analysis, our foundational filter. Now, qualitative analysis gets a bad rap. It's often totally misunderstood. It is absolutely not just guesswork or, going with your gut. Actually, there's a huge exam trap right here you need to watch out for. You have to know the difference between nominal and ordinal classification. Nominal classification, that's just grouping things by their nature. Is it a technical risk, regulatory, environmental? It just helps us figure out who owns it. But ordinal classification puts them in an order of magnitude. This is where you actually rank things as low, medium, or high relative to one another. You definitely need both, but remember, they serve completely different purposes.
Now, to get that ordinal ranking, the probability impact, or PI matrix, is going to be your primary tool. But here's the secret sauce for making it actually work. It is completely useless, literally useless, unless all your stakeholders share the exact same definitions before you even start scoring. I mean, if my definition of a high-impact cost overrun is 5% and yours is 20%, our matrix is already broken. You've got to calibrate these scales using historical data. And always remember, the matrix is there to support your expert judgment, not blindly replace it.
So that means we really have to look beyond just probability and impact. Think about this for a second. Would you treat a high-impact risk that's due in 18 months the exact same way as a medium-impact risk that's probably going to hit next week? Obviously not, right? A catastrophic risk that's 2 years away gives you plenty of runway to plan, while a moderate risk hitting next Tuesday means you need to act right now. This introduces two really vital parameters: urgency, which is how soon we must act, and proximity, which is when the risk actually impacts our objectives. Let's look at a real-world example from a county health digitization project. Take risk R3 here, the data privacy gap. Sure, it has a low probability of happening, but because it's a compliance risk with a totally catastrophic, very high impact, we're talking massive data breaches, complete loss of public trust, it rightfully demands a high priority ranking. This perfectly shows why context and knowing your organization's specific risk thresholds matters just as much as those raw probability scores.
Which brings us to our next section, defeating human bias to ensure data quality.
Look, even the absolute best tools in the world won't save you if your data is messed up by human psychology. Because risk scoring relies so heavily on stakeholder input, the exam explicitly expects you to identify and help your teams navigate these cognitive biases. You've got optimism bias, that's when the team just assumes everything is going to go perfectly. You've got to watch out for anchoring, where everyone in the meeting fixates on the very first budget number someone throws out. Then there's availability bias, where people freak out over a risk simply because they saw something similar on the news yesterday. And of course, the classic groupthink, where the loudest voice in the room takes over and all the dissenting experts just stay quiet.
Applying our scholar lens here, behavioral economics experts Kahneman and Tversky actually validate this perfectly. They point out that facilitating expert judgment isn't just taking notes on what people say.
You have to actively challenge assumptions to make sure the data you're feeding into your risk register is actually reliable. Okay, moving into task 2, quantitative analysis, or what we call selective numerical logic. Once we've filtered out the noise, we start turning that uncertainty into hard numbers. But heads up, here is another massive exam trap. Candidates all the time assume that qualitative analysis is somehow a lesser or basic version of quantitative analysis. Completely false. Qualitative analysis is applied to all identified risks. Quantitative analysis, that is only applied selectively. You're only going to run those complex mathematical models when the financial or schedule stakes of a specific risk are high enough to justify the heavy effort and the cost of modeling it in the first place. So here is your ultimate Task 2 toolkit. You really need to memorize these distinctions for the exam. You're going to use expected monetary value, or EMV, when you're comparing direct financial alternatives. You'll use decision trees when you're facing diverging paths of choices under uncertainty. Now, when you need to understand the overall project confidence level, like what's the actual percentage chance we finish this on time, that's when you run a Monte Carlo simulation. And finally, if you want to find out which specific variables are driving the absolute most exposure, you use sensitivity analysis. That's the one often visualized as a tornado diagram, where you're really just focusing on the longest bars. Pulling directly from the official PMI practice guide, let's highlight the specific strengths and weaknesses you are definitely going to be tested on. Notice how EMV is fantastic because it's a pretty simple calculation. It incorporates both probability and impact to give you a weighted average. But as the guide warns, it really only gives you that expected value. Decision trees, on the other hand, are incredible for mapping out complex paths, but they are also super fragile. If your input probabilities are really just wild guesses, the recommendation your entire tree spits out is going to be fundamentally unstable. And the practice guide also emphasizes the really distinct role of the probability and impact matrix here. It explicitly allows the organization to prioritize risks for further analysis. It literally acts as the bridge. You use your qualitative PI matrix to figure out exactly which select few risks are actually dangerous enough to warrant the heavy lifting of those quantitative techniques we just talked about. Make sense? Now let's tackle task 3, threats and opportunities. This is where we are widening the lens. Now that we've analyzed our initial risks, we have to widen our perspective to find those hidden opportunities, because rigorous analysis almost always uncovers secondary threats and possibilities that we completely missed the first time around. The exam is going to test your ability to use specific tools to map out all this project complexity. You'll need to know that SWOT analysis ensures an equal focus on internal strengths and weaknesses alongside external opportunities and threats. You'll use Ashikawa, fishbone diagrams to trace interconnected root causes. And crucially, you have to perform impact analysis not just on your budget, but across scope, schedule, quality, and even how a risk might violate overarching corporate compliance and strategic goals. It's the whole picture. I absolutely love this perspective from scholar Douglas Hubbard. When we're deep in the weeds of all this analysis, it is so easy to get paralyzed just waiting for perfect data. But as Hubbard reminds us, the goal of risk analysis isn't perfect clairvoyance. We're not mind readers. The goal is simply to use the best qualitative and quantitative tools we have available to progressively turn terrifying unknown unknowns into manageable, actionable insights.
All right, let's bring it home. Final exam takeaways, tying it all together.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. If you write down just one thing to absolutely dominate this 23% of the exam, make it this. Qualitative analysis prioritizes individual risks using agreed-upon definitions. Quantitative analysis is selectively applied to calculate numerical exposure and reserves. Always, always remember that risk analysis is an iterative loop. It just gets better as your project data gets better. And here is a golden rule for exam questions. Never, ever select a risk response strategy before the analysis is completely finished, unless the scenario clearly, explicitly states that it's an absolute immediate emergency. So to truly lock this knowledge in, I want you to step away from the theory for a second and look at your real life. Think about the absolute biggest risk on your current project today. How would you classify it? What's its exact urgency? And most importantly, based on what we've learned today, would spending the time and money to run a quantitative model actually add value, or is a really solid qualitative ranking enough? Apply this explainer to your own work right now, and you'll be well on your way to mastering the PMI-RMP exam. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.